Because not all of the trials were held at one time, there are individual rulings. The trials spanned from 1889 to 1901. One of the most controversial characters of the feud has to be Mounts, and he is also the only person to have been hung for the crimes. Sometime in August 1864, Ellison was born in Logan County, West Virginia. He was the illegitimate son of Ellison, who was killed in the Election Day 1882 brawl, and his first cousin, Harriet Hatfield. Harriet married Daniel Mounts in 1887, and Ellison was raised by him. On December 25, 1882, Ellison married Rebecca Justice, the daughter of Jacob Justice and Elizabeth Farrell. There is no record of any children being born in this marriage. Ellison is often described as being dim-witted at that time, so he was possibly mentally handicapped, and also an albino as he had white hair, hence his name Cotton Top. However, he is also described as being mean and vicious, earning his place and reputation among his kinfolk. However you view Mounts, his story is an interesting one. Mounts tried to retract his confession because he claims he made it to be shown leniency, but the retraction was denied. It is also thought, since Mounts was very well known to have a mental handicap, that leniency would also be allowed on those grounds as well. There were also rumors that he had been promised a bribe and pressured to give a confession with the promise of a rescue. This did not happen, and he was sentenced to hang by a jury regardless of how the confession happened and despite a guilty plea. Testimony also came out that Cap Hatfield was the cause behind the murders, but this was not taken into consideration. On February 18, 1890, he was hung in Kentucky's last public execution and buried in an unmarked grave within the sight of the gallows. His last words were reportedly, quote, "They made me do it. The Hatfields made me do it," unquote. It is unclear if he meant his participation in the shooting and burning of the McCoy cabin New Year's night 1888, or if it was because of his forced confession. Even though Kentucky had officially stopped public executions, thousands of people attended his hanging in Pikeville. Although the gallows were open and people could view the hanging, a fence was placed around the gallows in compliance with the law of the time, stating that there were no more public executions. The current site of the execution is now a classroom building for the University of Pikeville. Mounts' last words, quote, "The Hatfields made me do it," unquote. The only hanged man for the feud and the last man to be hanged from the gallows in Pike County, Kentucky. Before Mounts, 40 years had passed since the last public execution, and after Mounts, no one was ever executed in the city again. Mounts is buried in an unmarked grave at Dill Cemetery in Pikeville, Kentucky. William Anderson Cap Hatfield II was the second son of Ancy Hatfield and his wife Lavista Chafin. He got his nickname Captain from the Civil War, which was later shortened to Cap. He was born February 6, 1864 in Mingo County, West Virginia. He married Nancy Elizabeth Smith on October 11, 1883, and they had several children together. When Cap's older brother Johns removed himself from the feud, Cap took his place as Ancy's lieutenant. Cap's nature of being of a quarrelsome disposition and his love of violence were legendary in the mountains. He was a man that preferred to settle things with his fists and guns rather than to talk things over with a discussion. He believed that it was his duty to be offended and to exact vengeance. He is also known to have killed Jeff McCoy in 1886, for which he was never charged or convicted for this crime. and at one time was a deputy sheriff of Logan County, West Virginia. There are conflicting reports as to when Cap was arrested. Some say he was arrested on the day his Uncle Jim Vance was killed. Others say that he escaped that day but was arrested on another day. However, he did spend time at the Logan County Jail, which later became Mingo County, and he did escape. There is a lot of testimony from the McCoys that Cap was the ringleader of the New Year's Night Massacre. Randolph McCoy gave testimony that it was Cap that killed his daughter Alifair that night. Since this testimony conflicted with the confession of Mounts, it was discarded. However, because of his escape, he eluded justice and was never brought to trial. He died August 22, 1930, at the age of 66 at Johns Hopkins Hospital of a brain ailment in Baltimore, Maryland. Valentine Uncle Wall Hatfield was convicted for the involvement of the murders of the McCoy children. He might not have been involved in the attack that sent him to prison for life. Other than family lore, there is no evidence that Hatfield was or was not among the group of men accused and convicted of the murders. However, Hatfield died in the cell block claiming that he was innocent of the charges against him. Johnson, known as Johns Hatfield, was the oldest son of Anise Hatfield. He was born on January 6, 1862. He was the last person to be sentenced in the trial for the murders of Alifair and Calvin McCoy. It took 10 years for his case to come to a jury. He served 13 years of his life sentence. He is buried at the Hatfield Cemetery, Sarah Ann, Logan County, West Virginia. He is forever remembered as the Romeo of the Appalachian Mountains. Pliant Mahon was the son-in-law of Valentine Hatfield. After a disappointing case going through the Supreme Court, Pliant Mahon was sentenced to life in prison. After serving 14 years in prison before returning home to rejoin his ex-wife, who had since remarried. However, she left her second husband to rejoin Pliant. Doc D. Mahon was the brother of Pliant and also the son-in-law to Valentine Hatfield. Doc also served 14 years of a life sentence involving the McCoy children's death. After prison, he returned home to live with his son, Melvin. The other men who were convicted of the murders were Robert Hatfield, who spent life in prison, Elliot Hatfield, life in prison, French Ellis, life in prison, Charles Gillespie, life in prison, and Thomas Chambers, life in prison. Between the years of 1880 and 1888, there had been more than a dozen people die and 10 people wounded on both sides of the conflict. 8 of the 9 Hatfield family members were given life sentences, and 1 was hanged for the crimes. Over the next couple of years, there were other trials and convictions for their roles in the feud. However, both sides pretty much gave up on continuing the feud at this point in time. Altogether, the feud had lasted only 30 years. In 1891, Cap Hatfield published a letter in the local newspaper in the Baltimore Sun that read in part, quote, "The war spirit in me has abated. A general amnesty has now been declared in the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud," unquote. Both sides had major losses in the family, and they declared amnesty from the fight. In the year 2000, Randolph McCoy's great-great-great-grandsons, Bo and Ron McCoy, organized a joint family reunion of the two families. This held great national attention as the family had never come together before. More than 5,000 people were in attendance. On June 14, 2003, in Pikeville, Kentucky, the McCoy cousins partnered with Rio Hatfield of Waynesboro, Virginia, to declare the official truce between the families. This concludes the last of the actual feud proper that will be covered in this series. However, in our next series of videos, we will cover the Matewan War, the battle for Blair Mountain, which is often regarded as a continuation of the feud. We hope that you have enjoyed this series on the feud so far. Thank you for watching.